I have a sister who's making a difference, and her name is Kristine Huskey. She is author of the recently published Justice at Guantanamo, One Woman's Odyssey and Her Crusade for Human Rights. She's an attorney, she's a law professor, and she is co-director of the National Security Clinic at the University of Texas School of Law, which she established in 2007 and served as director for 2 years. So I'll let her take over. Thank you again for coming.
Oh, she does. Well, thank you for that very warm welcome, and special thanks to my sister and your colleague, Kim Huskey. She really is a great food person, and for her support in bringing me here, and to Google support for bringing me here, and to all of you for showing up, whether out of friendship for Kim or your interest in the book. So thank you. So first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book, and you can all hear me, right? Okay, I'll tell you a little bit about the book, read a passage, maybe two, depending on the time, and then take questions. So what is the book about? It's really two stories. And the first story is my personal and what some people might say unconventional, or some people might say strange, journey from being a reckless, dancing on bars, bartender and model with my sister, in New York City, to being part of a legal team before the Supreme Court on a high-profile, very controversial, internationally known case that was being heralded as one of the most significant human rights, civil rights cases since Brown v. Board. You can imagine how long and strange that journey might have been. The second story is the story of Guantanamo. And it's not the story you might read in the newspapers or, the New York Times, Washington Post. It's not the story you might read in a Harvard Law Review with 300 footnotes. So it's not a legal story. It's not a policy story. It's a story of Guantanamo from a human perspective and from what it was like just a few years out of law school, really, representing suspected terrorists, having grown up at Guantanamo, having grown up in Alaska with parents and grandparents who were in the military, and if asked, they probably would have said they were Republicans. And my sister's rolling her eyes. And all of a sudden, here I was, representing suspected terrorists. So that's the second piece, and it's interwoven with my personal journey. It's really the human side, hopefully the human side of Guantanamo and how it started. So the book opens with me, 18 years old, in New York City, living with Kim in a basement apartment, and I somehow moved to Angola, Africa, 18 years old, and where Angola, was in the middle of a raging civil war. I learned to live without running water. I learned to speak Portuguese. There were curfews and travel restrictions. And the book starts with this high adventure, hopefully, and kind of keeps the reader through one adventure after another, talking about my adventures there in Angola, then taking me back to New York. That's the reckless part. And I will say, as an aside, my editor asked me when I was writing that chapter on New York, can you put some more detail in there? And I said, I'm a lawyer, and I might have a career ahead of me, so we'll leave those details out. If you want more details, you can ask Kim for the reckless details part. So after really a year of sort of bright lights, big city, if anybody remembers that movie, I really pulled myself together, inspired really by my sister, to go to Columbia. We went to Columbia, and we both graduated with high honors. And, it sort of tells the story of what it's like to live in New York City, working, bartending, putting yourself through school, trying to make something of yourself, really. And then my life sort of took another turn, and I decided to model after graduating from Columbia with high honors. I guess maybe that's, another part of the strange journey, and found myself modeling in videos, and one in particular. Again, some of you might be too young to remember this, but there was an MTV video called "Knock into Boots." Yeah, okay. So yes, I was in that video. So that's really part one of the book. It's all those adventures, modeling, Columbia, bartending, all these crazy things. And finally, I decide to really be a professional And so that's the majority of the book is about my professional life as a lawyer and about Guantanamo. And so I go into law school, of course, wanting to save the world. And I come out of law school, and what do? I work for a big law firm which represents evil corporations, as my sister used to describe me. And I did that for a couple years and somehow found myself shortly after starting work at this law firm that's headquartered here in New York, representing Guantanamo detainees. Now, this was more than 7 years ago and just 6 months after 9/11. Which, if anybody was in New York at the time, probably remembers it pretty vividly. I was actually here on a case staying at the Waldorf. And I was at this law firm, and the law firm was approached by a couple of Kuwaiti families who were looking for their sons. Now, if anybody remembers, back then, Guantanamo was a big secret, and the administration wanted to keep it that way. And it was a legal black hole, and there were no lawyers allowed there, and there were no, really no outside organizations other than the Red Cross. And any information that came out about Guantanamo was, well, these guys are all terrorists, and they chew through hydraulic cable to kill American men and women. Well, those were my clients. And the Kuwaiti families basically said, we can't seem to find our sons who'd been overseas. Nobody in the American embassy will talk to us. Nobody in the U.S. government will talk to us. And so we decided that we would have to file a lawsuit against the U.S. government in order to force the government to come forward and just confirm that they had custody of these Kuwaiti citizens. And so we filed a lawsuit in May of 2002. And I thought, the lawsuit was basically, these guys deserve due process. What about the Fifth Amendment? They should have charges and trial. And I thought, who can be against due process? What judge is going to turn that down? We weren't asking them to be released. We were just asking that they be charged, given a trial, a chance to prove their innocence. And shockingly enough, back then, to me, it was shocking. Now the world seems to be somewhat different. The judge agreed with the government. And what the government said was not that they don't get due process. What the government was saying is that Guantanamo is not the U.S., and those men there are foreign citizens. And so not even the U.S. courts should be overseeing the custody of these people who are human beings, that no U.S. court was allowed to have authorization to hear claims by these men. And to me, that was just an astounding thing. I mean, we wrote in this first brief, we said the government essentially is taking the position that they could go around the world and pick up people off the streets and put them at Guantanamo and torture them. Well, actually, now we sort of know that's what they did, but back then we sort of asked it as a rhetorical question, like, how could this possibly be? But the court agreed with the government that the men at Guantanamo should not even have a right to be in court and challenge their detention. They didn't have a right to have a trial, that they could be tortured without even going into court and complaining about it. Either I was naive or the world really had changed. I think more so, as somebody mentioned, Phil here, that the U.S. changed and we were in a different time and in a different place than the rest of the world. So the book goes on, the story goes on about the litigation that I did and fighting in the courts, and as a young attorney, all of a sudden, finding myself at the Supreme Court and doing these moots. They're called moots, where you practice arguing, with law professors. And, here I was just out of law school, and we're about to go in front of the Supreme Court. So that was, it's from the book, and the story is from the eyes of a young lawyer who's sort of taking this all in and taking in what's going on, at Guantanamo and around the world. Now, during that time, we were not allowed to even meet with our clients or even talk to them on the phone because the government had control of these people. And it was sort of an eye-opener for me. What I realized was just really how much control the government can have over the life of a person, and without I think, people interjecting or bringing litigation, they can just take them to some, Caribbean island and do whatever they want with them. So that was sort of a big lesson for me to learn how much control the government has. So we get to the Supreme Court, and lo and behold, we actually win. And this is the well-known Rasul case. It came out in 2004 and was the first case in which the Supreme Court said the detainees at Guantanamo are entitled to challenge their detention. They are allowed to go into court and say, you've got the wrong guy, you made a mistake, or the law doesn't support me being here, and just essentially challenge their detention, something that goes back to the Magna Carta, which we, I think, under the Bush administration had just really thrown to the side, this idea of the rule of law. So after the Supreme Court came out was the first time we were then allowed to go visit our clients in Guantanamo. And so the passage that I'm going to read is about my first trip to Guantanamo 2.5 years after beginning the representation of them. Okay. Those first meetings with our clients at Guantanamo, in which we played the DVD from their families, introduced ourselves to them, and began the long process of getting to know them, were epic moments in my legal career, in my life. It was unlike any other client meeting I'd ever had. Indeed, the last time I'd met with a client, I'd been sitting at the bar of the Four Seasons in New York, because I represented evil corporations. Neil, Tom, and I, that was the three people, Neil and Tom are my colleagues at the law firm of Sherman and Sterling, who are also on the legal team. Neil, Tom, and I had spent more than 2 years of our lives working on behalf of these men that we'd never met, and it felt strange to know of them, but not to know them. We were brought into an interview room at Camp Echo, this is at Guantanamo, where we found one of our clients sitting at a small card table, handcuffed and chained to an O-ring bolted to the floor. Suddenly, seeing a real person in front of me, I realized that until that moment, I had thought of our clients as a faceless group, the 12 Croates, like some forgotten religious order. And they were forgotten in a way. Sometimes I even thought of my client as being the rule of law. And that was often how I tried to explain my work to the press and other audiences. After meeting them, though, and putting faces with names, I'd never be able to think of them that way again. They were people, too. And even though I'd known it all along, it had become a distant fact after months filled with litigation, when any rare time to myself had been filled with enjoying my American freedoms. Meanwhile, these men, my clients, were being held as criminals, accused of nothing, and yet certainly suspected of much. So that was the first trip to Guantanamo, and thereafter I would take at least 15 or 16 trips to Guantanamo, the most recent being in April. And every time I'd go, I'd learn something new from my clients, whether they'd tell me of some abuse they'd been through while they were held in Bagram or in Guantanamo, or I'd be subject to some new rule. One time in the beginning of those visits, we were allowed to go to the public library on the base, and then thereafter we weren't allowed to go to the public library. Never explained why. But this whole process was teaching me so much about, again, the power of the government and how it affects real people. And that was something that I learned sort of in that moment, was the rule of law is so important to us. As in America, this idea of the rule of law, and we sort of talk about it, and Obama talked about it a lot. But the import of that is that it affects real people, real human beings, and it protects us, as well as people who are at Guantanamo who are foreign citizens. But I think the hardest visits that I had at Guantanamo were when my clients were on hunger strike. And they were hunger striking for a couple of reasons. One, they were hunger striking to protest their conditions. They felt they were not being treated humanely. And indeed, in the beginning of their stay at Guantanamo, I learned that they had exercise 20 minutes a week, that they weren't allowed any reading materials except for the Quran, which actually wasn't even provided to them until several months after they'd been there. that they'd been subject to interrogation, sleep deprivation, hot and cold extremes, that they really were treated not like suspected terrorists, but like terrorists. And they'd never had a trial. And this went on for a very long time, this sort of treatment. So I learned all of this. They were protesting that. They were also protesting just the fact that they had not been charged. And I had this one client who used to say, just give me a trial. Just give me the chance to prove that I'm innocent. And people used to ask me at that time, are your clients innocent? And I said, well, give them a trial and we'll find out. If they're not innocent, we'll hang them up by their toes. But the whole point is to let them try to prove their innocence. The whole point is to have a process whereby you sort out the guilty from the innocent. And that was always what we were litigating about and what the Guantanamo detainees were protesting about. So they went on this hunger strike. At the height of the hunger strike, there were probably 150 detainees on hunger strike, not eating, protesting their conditions and the lack of trial. So next passage is from that experience, which was really quite traumatic for me, and I wasn't even on hunger strike. I thought about Fozzie, one of my clients, and the other hunger strikers who had said they would rather die than eat. What that meant for Fozzie was that if he got his way, if his feeding tube was removed, and he continued his hunger strike, he would die. And by the looks of him, I didn't think it would take very long. It was pretty obvious to me that the only thing keeping him alive was that feeding tube, and he wanted to be rid of it. As an aside, the Guantanamo health professionals had basically forced them to eat because they didn't want them to die. Meanwhile, they were torturing them on the side. So a lot of the detainees were subject to feeding tubes. We were his lawyers. We were supposed to be working on his behalf, in his best interests. Shouldn't we be petitioning the court to stop the force feeding? If Fozzie wants to die, I said back in D.C., behind the closed doors of Tom's office, again, Tom was the law partner I worked with on this case, we should let him die. I was devastated, but firmly believed that it should be Fozzie's right to determine his fate, should he decide to see his hunger strike through to the end. It had only been a week since we'd been back from Guantanamo, and the shock of seeing 5 of our clients on hunger strike, 2 of them dangerously close to death or serious illness, had not left either of us. Tom didn't want to see Fozzie die either and was just as determined to save him. That's not what the families want, Kristine, Tom said. I know, Tom, but who's our client here? Is it Fozzie or his family? What about what Fozzie wants? What are we going to do, ask the court to let him die? Tom was shouting. I shouted back, who are you to decide what's best for Fozzie? Who made you God? And suddenly I was crying too, and Tom jumped up to hug me. Now, mind you, this is a no-no, right? In a big law firm, you don't do that. But Tom and I were human, and we were upset. Tom and I both knew that we had an ethical obligation to do as our client wished, and yet we couldn't bring ourselves to be the ones to seal Fozzie's fate, a slow death in a cell at the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center. Had we known we'd be having a conversation of this magnitude when we first met with the Kuwaiti families, in which someone's life was in our hands, maybe we wouldn't have agreed to take their case. But there we were, neck deep in a case that seemed impossible at every turn, where every decision we made seemed to have either substantial consequences or no impact at all on somebody else's welfare. It was just getting to us. I think now's a good time to answer questions.
If anybody has a question, you can use.
Oh, yes, you must use that microphone. You must use that microphone. Somebody must have some question. Kim, you're supposed to, oh, sorry. Yes.
There's a mic.
Oh.
Can I bring it over there? Thanks. Is it on?
Testing? Okay. If you had to guess, what percentage of the prisoners that you saw at Guantanamo Bay would you say were guilty?
Well, no, that's a good question. I mean, like I said, in the beginning, when I first started this representation, a lot of people asked, are they guilty? Are they innocent? Are your clients? The truth is, in some ways, all that, the 7 years of litigation was always about whether or not the courts even had the authority to hear these claims, right? So it wasn't until recently that the lawyers were even allowed to ask for discovery of the evidence, which was supposed to prove that they were guilty or not guilty. So it's really only in the last year that lawyers who represent the detainees are actually getting documents, notes of interrogations and such like that. So from sort of from a practical standpoint, if you'd asked me that question a year ago, I would have said, I have no idea. But the truth is, so since in the last year, since they're called habeas cases, right? Habeas means the right to challenge your detention, the writ of habeas in our Constitution, not to be suspended. There have been 33 actual habeas cases, which means the lawyers went in and tried to prove that they were innocent, and the government went in and tried to prove they were guilty. Out of the 33, 28 federal judges granted the writ of habeas, which means that they are innocent. So, I mean, that's a sort of astounding statistic. I think another interesting, point to follow up on that is, back, again, when I was saying back in 2002, when they were talking about, all these terrorists at Guantanamo, this, that, and the other, eventually it came out based on the Department of Defense's own statistical information that only 5% of the people at Guantanamo, and at that time it was about 400, 5% had actually been picked up by U.S. forces. The other 95% were picked up by Pakistani officials, either military or even just police. Some had been turned over by villagers or Northern Alliance or Afghan, local authorities. So I think that's a big, when you ask the question, how many are guilty, you start with that sort of statistic, and you think about, how can it be that, with that chain of custody in mind, that every single person who's at Guantanamo is guilty of terrorism. Of course, as a good lawyer, I would never tell you what I think about my clients.
Yeah, I wonder if it even matters at all if any of them are guilty, because that's not really the fundamental issue. I mean, it's really unfortunate for some of the individuals if they happen to be innocent and they're there, but there's a small number of them. The real problem to me seems to be that the system has changed. When I was a kid, I grew up mainly overseas. We were always being attacked by, people for being Americans and the rest. But my parents were always able to tell me, we don't start wars without provocation. We treat prisoners well. We don't torture. This whole long list of things that even if we were being criticized for things, you could still hold your head up for being an American, because being an American stood for something. Unfortunately, I have a daughter today who comes to me and asks me questions about the country. I can't tell her the same things my parents told me. Something changed fundamentally at Guantanamo, also Abu Ghraib and some other such things. But Guantanamo was a really important one in that sort of our expectations of what we do in conflicts are now different. It used to be you'd have a war, you get prisoners, and there were some rules on prisoners. You can't photograph them, you got to treat them nice. You let their officers have a role in the community, and basically you're just warehousing them till the conflict is over, and then you send them home. And you're not allowed to torture them, and you got to treat them, feed them well, and all the rest of that sort of stuff. At least those were the rules that we had. But now we're making this distinction between what's a prisoner of war and what's a terrorist. And terrorists apparently, we can do strange things to that we couldn't do to prisoners of war. And guys who seem like they should have been prisoners of war being terrorists, et cetera. Anyway, you all went to court. You had a bunch of things changed. But what were you not able to fix? How is our system different today after Guantanamo than it was before? What have we lost?
Well, you raised many good points, and some which I should have hit on in the beginning, talking about Guantanamo. One of the original problems of Guantanamo, like I said, was it was a legal black hole, and what that really meant was, the Bush administration was saying they're not prisoners of war, And so the Geneva Conventions don't apply, which are the set of international rules which sort of govern how we treat prisoners when we're in a conflict. And they're terrorists, but they're at Guantanamo, so federal, U.S. law doesn't apply. And you're right. I mean, the real issue is that, Guantanamo is this sort of become a symbol for how the U.S. has changed. I don't know if the world, I think the world has changed as some with respect to how we look at terrorism, preventive detention, the laws of war, but I think the U.S. changed the most, in part because of 9/11. So the issue has become, and it's an issue now that's being debated by the Obama administration. That's something I think we all need to think about. Do we sort of go back to pre 9/11 and we say, listen, if they're accused of being terrorists, we have criminal laws that are that we've used in our courts. In New York, actually, several terrorism cases, and they were convicted, and they're serving in maximum security prisons. And that's sort of the pre 9/11 paradigm. Or do we have something that, as I mentioned, is being sort of contemplated, is this idea that you could have suspected terrorists who aren't charged with terrorism. They're not in a law of war paradigm because they're not really in a traditional armed conflict. And so therefore we will detain them because we're afraid that they might commit some terrorist act. And that is what's being, as I said, seriously considered by the Obama administration. So that, I think, is what has changed fundamentally, is this idea that we no longer can apply the traditional laws of war. We possibly can't apply our U.S. criminal laws, anti-terrorism laws, and we're sort of now in this kind of middle course contemplating holding people because we think they might do something bad or wrong. And they're grappling with, are there laws that support that? So go back to, I think, your second or maybe third question. What didn't we fix? Well, a lot. A lot. There's still people at Guantanamo, although thankfully Obama came out and said he's going to close Guantanamo. But I think that's sort of the biggest piece. The biggest piece is that somehow maybe we weren't able to demonstrate how terrible it is to have a legal black hole, how terrible it is not to have laws that apply, such that they're now seriously considering preventive detention. And I agree with you. In the beginning we used to talk about, how could this be that we don't have the application of some kind of law here? Because what brings us together as, in America as citizens and residents is not that we have Coke and Levi's, although that's, certainly an American thing, but it was being so proud of our system, our democracy, our justice system. We have one of the best justice systems in the world. And, now that's changed. That's changed.
Hi. You've talked a little bit about how this whole experience made you realize just how much power the government has and how long it took for the courts to come through and say, yes, the law does apply to these people, and years and years and years. So I'm curious what your thoughts are, and you could talk a little bit about what you feel the role of the courts should be versus what it is, whether you think they should have more power to affect what the president's doing, whether they should be able to act more quickly, I suppose kind of the glacial pace they move at now, whether they should have jurisdiction over more areas, like these kind of legal black hole areas that they don't seem to be able to touch. That's kind of open-ended, so yeah. But just
No,
hearing
I
you
mean
talk
that's
about it.
as a young lawyer, when I started doing this litigation, it was every step of the way was sort of eye-opening, and starting at the lower court and finally making your way up to the Supreme Court. As you said, like everything sort of moved so glacially, and I just thought, geez, even if we win, it'll be 2.5 years later, and these guys will have spent their entire, an important part of their life there. So part of me says, it should be faster. The courts should have more power. They should be able to do something faster. But another part of me really respects that it is, part of it is sort of, it's such a slow process because the goal is to let each party take the time to, brief everything and look at the law, and for the judge to ponder it, give the government a chance to, possibly change its ways or put forward its reasoning. And then you have the whole system of appeals, which in our case, that was terrible. It sucked. Like, oh, we're going to go to appeal. But if you think about it from the reverse, if you were, let's say you were convicted of something and you were innocent, and you are maybe put, sentenced to the death penalty, you would want all those, you want, a chance to keep appealing and appealing. So, it's sort of, I guess I go sort of both ways. I agree with you in many ways. Oh, it's too slow. But at the same time, I really do have great respect for our justice system, which really seems to give an opportunity to find the truth. And sometimes finding the truth can take a long time because you give a chance for all parties to weigh in. And then, and then you go to the next court. And then you do it all over again. And then you go to the next court. But I mean, a good example, while we were sort of going up to the Supreme Court, after the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had ruled, and we were going to Guantanamo, we learned all these things about, they wanted to have more reading materials, and they wanted to have more exercise, and then they wanted to have this sort of scholarly commentary on the Quran. And we petitioned the court for all this, and basically, because the government said, no way, they don't get that, nope. And the court, what the court did? They just ignored our motions, which was devastating.
Hi. Thanks a lot. This is very fascinating stuff.
Thank you.
Couple of questions. Do you think there are other black holes like this in the world? Because I would certainly suspect that there are. And to address earlier comments about believing in America and all things American being good, I grew up in that sort of, as the offspring of the golden generation of the United States, and believing all those things. But Vietnam pretty much nailed that box shut for me. With recent events like Laura Ling and Yoon Lee with North Korea, the hikers in Iraq, Iran, other taking of individuals, do you think the U.S. was using Guantanamo Bay as sort of a collection of bargaining chips? Like, we're going to gather a bunch of people and use them if we need to negotiate, or some sort of balance?
I mean, there definitely was, at some point, what they were called the CIA black sites, where they did bring, and this sort of came out after Guantanamo had come out, right? And so we were looking at Guantanamo like, oh, it's this legal black hole, and then we find out there's sites that are even more of a legal black hole than Guantanamo, which it's just what, and then it was during the Bush administration that he said he was going to shut them down. And actually, in 2006, Congress passed a law about the military commissions, and what I think was in sort of a manipulative moved a lot of the detainees from these black sites to Guantanamo, and said to Congress, okay, now you have to pass this law because now all these high-value detainees are there, and they should be put through some sort of system. Throughout the 7.5 years that I've been litigating and representing detainees and working on these issues, every time something happens, when Abu Ghraib came out and the black sites, I said, oh, it can't get any worse, there can't be another breaking news story about what this government is doing with national security and our rights, But then it came out that they were wiretapping American citizens, So, it's one. I mean, I'm sort of I'm happy with how the book ended because it ends with the Obama administration coming in, and I say, I have hope. And of course, that's his catchphrase. But so I hope that we don't have those black sites anymore. But in some ways, you can't really be sure, right? Until you sort of find out. I think whether or not Guantanamo was a bargaining chip, I would say during the Bush administration, it probably was to some degree. I feel like, for me, I'm still sort of waiting to see what the Obama administration does, how they handle certain things. I think they're scrambling. Most recently, they were supposed to come out with a report on how they were going to handle the detainees at Guantanamo, what they were going to do with them, whether or not they would have some sort of preventive detention. And the task force came out and said, it's going to be delayed. It's going to be another 6 months, which in another 6 months, Guantanamo is supposed to be shut down. So I think it really remains to be seen what the administration is going to do with a lot of these issues. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Sort of related to some of the previous questions. So what is your experience and opinion about how all this affected the international opinion about the U.S. justice system? Both technically, so what are the laws or whatever, what U.S. changed, and more like politically or perception-wise. And related to this, it's a technical question because I don't know anything about law. When in 2002, the judge agreed with the government that they cannot be sued in U.S. court, did you consider suing the United States in international court?
We did. I mean, the international, both from the legal and the policy perspective, is very interesting. I think, from just a policy perspective, and I've traveled overseas a lot, for my business and also just for fun, but the response from the international community, I think, has largely been disappointment, disbelief. The U.S. used to hold itself out as the champion of human rights, and people would say, how can we hold our heads up? It's something that was mentioned earlier. And the international community, again, from a policy perspective, was like, now you can't really tell us what to do, right? From a legal perspective, there's been just a lot of criticism about the numerous violation of international treaties by the United States. I mean, they've signed on to the Torture Against Convention. They've signed on to the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And lo and behold, the U.S. had several children under the age of 16 at Guantanamo, detained with adult people. They signed on to the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. And that, quite honestly, and I think the Bush administration really, quite frankly, didn't give a damn about international law. And it just sort of went out the window. But a lot of international lawyers were very concerned because the U.S. was always a leader in international law and getting other countries to sign on to these treaties that were so important. Right? And an interesting thing about, again, sort of international aspect of it is that, from what I hear, this is a little bit of gossip and rumor, many U.S. officials who were in power during the Bush administration are afraid to travel overseas because there's this concept of universal jurisdiction, which means if you've committed war crimes and you're in a country that believes in universal jurisdiction, the Spanish authorities can arrest you and put you in a trial in their courts. And so I hear that a lot of the U.S. Bush officials will not travel to Italy or Spain or anywhere in the EU. And recently, Italy indicted 8 CIA CIA agents. They were not in Italy at the time, but they basically sort of put out a EU-wide warrant for their arrest, saying they were part of these 8 CIA agents were in Italy and I think kidnapped individuals and brought them to either Bagram or Guantanamo or one of these other black sites. So did I answer your second question?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Come here.
I have one follow-up question to the previous question. So You mentioned that Guantanamo was this black hole of a kind, and you hope that there would be no more black holes like this. But when you look at it, it seems essentially that after 9/11, it turned out that the Constitution and the laws are more or less quite malleable in the sense that you can justify quite a lot of things by saying, you know, the executive branch basically has the right to do quite a lot of things. And I just wonder if you feel there's any thing which could be done to amend the system to make sure that things like this could not happen in the future, because, well, there was a Supreme Court decision which made some progress, but essentially it seems like these things, there isn't like a black wall put in the past which would guarantee that such things couldn't occur in the future.
No, one of the big criticisms of the Bush administration, among others, was the sort of abuse of executive power, and they sort of became inflated with this idea that Bush was the executive. It's a national security crisis. I can do anything, but I think they really took it quite far, and they had lawyers who would write long legal opinions, just like you said, about how it was justified, how it really was legal. And that it wasn't a violation of the Constitution. You could take the view of Shakespeare, who said, "Kill all the lawyers," then you wouldn't have legal opinions backing that up. But that was a joke. But you're right. The problem. It's both a problem and a great thing about this country, though, is we have the Constitution, which has been called, it's a living document, right? Which means that it changes with the time. Some of the Supreme Court opinions, about discrimination are vastly different from, 1918 in the Dred Scott case to Brown v. Board. So the fact that it's not hard and fast has allowed great things in this country, but at the same time, it has allowed terrible things to happen. I think it is, in many ways, something that points to we have to really hold officials accountable, because I think that's really the solution. I don't know that we could pass a law that would change the Constitution. In some ways, I think that might come back to hurt us to have a hard and fast rule. I think it means holding officials, whether it's your state representative or your representative, on the Hill in Washington, to the president, holding them accountable as a people, because the Constitution is supposed to protect us, not the executive branch. So I know that doesn't sound like a very easy solution, but I think in some ways, to me, that would be my preferred solution.
I think we're going to wrap it up. Kristine is going to hang around if you want to ask her some more questions, or she can sign your book if you'd like. But thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.